Marcus Bell never imagined his life would come down to a square of concrete, some blue water, and the opinions of people who had never once offered to help raise a child alone. After 22 years in food service, most of them spent behind the scenes managing logistics for school cafeterias across the state, he finally bought a small home in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of Montgomery. It wasn't big, but it had a private yard, space for a garden, and just enough land to build something Marcus had promised himself and his son long ago. A pool. Nothing fancy, nothing outrageous. Just a place to cool off during Alabama summers, to float under the sun, to be still in a world that had not granted him much stillness since his wife died 6 years ago. He'd researched everything before even submitting the building permit. The property wasn't part of any gated development or subject to shared use restrictions. The municipality had a clear code, and he followed it to the letter. The contractor he hired had decades of experience with residential installations. It was all done by the book: engineered drainage, safety railing, even a modest enclosure fence to keep out raccoons and the neighborhood kids who'd inevitably come sniffing around once the water went in. For Marcus, the pool was less about recreation than recovery. His son, Noah, 8 years old, gentle, quiet, thoughtful, had been struggling. The past year had been tough. He'd been hit by a car while crossing the street after school. A clean break, the doctor said, but the emotional toll had lingered far longer than the bone fracture. Nightmares, separation anxiety, a fear of being left alone, even for a moment. The water was therapy, both literally and figuratively. It soothed Noah, and it gave Marcus a rare sense of control in a life that had often left him feeling powerless. By the second weekend after installation, the pool was operational. Marcus set out 3 modest lawn chairs, installed a weatherproof storage box for towels and first aid supplies, and brought home 2 pool noodles and an inflatable ring that looked like a donut. They didn't throw a party. There was no music, no balloons, no crowd. Just father and son, sitting in waist-deep water, sharing popsicles as cicadas screamed from the trees. Noah smiled, genuinely, for the first time in months. Marcus sat back, letting the moment settle into his bones, reminding himself it had all been worth it. Then came the knock. It was late afternoon when he heard it. 3 sharp raps on the front door, too quick and assertive to be friendly. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find a tall, lean woman in a coral blouse and pressed khakis standing on his porch. Her hair was blonde and tightly curled, her lipstick immovable, her expression unreadable except for the glint of barely concealed irritation in her eyes. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she stared past Marcus toward the backyard. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice syrupy but clipped. "I'm Karen Whitlock. I live 2 houses down." Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Whitlock." "I just wanted to stop by since I saw the pool go in," she said, glancing toward the side yard where the top of the safety fence peeked above the hedges. "Some of us had concerns, and I thought it might be better to speak directly before it becomes a thing." Marcus hesitated. "Concerns?" She tilted her head, smile thinning. "You understand, I'm sure. A man living alone, building a pool, with children in the area, it raises eyebrows. People talk. There's a sense of risk." The words hung in the air like flies over something dead. Marcus stared at her, not quite believing what he'd heard. She didn't say it outright, but the implication was acid-etched. Risk. A man. Alone. With a pool. The kind of insinuation no amount of courtesy could clean up. He steadied his breath, fighting the spike of heat in his chest. "The pool is for my son. He's 8. We had all the permits approved. Everything's compliant." "Oh, of course," she said quickly, waving a manicured hand. "I'm sure you followed the rules. It's just that families here tend to prefer certain standards of transparency, a child-centered community. We don't want things to get murky." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He could feel Noah's presence behind him in the house, his son sitting quietly on the couch, probably listening to every word. He stepped outside, gently closing the door behind him. "With all due respect, Miss Whitlock, if you or anyone else in the neighborhood has concerns, they can talk to the city. I've got nothing to hide, and I don't appreciate the insinuation." She blinked, caught off guard by his directness. "It's just a conversation," she said softly. "No need to get defensive." "I'm not defensive," he replied. "I'm drawing a line. My home, my son, our business." Her expression flattened. "Well then," she said, turning crisply on her heel, "we'll see how it plays out." And with that, she walked away. The days that followed were quieter on the surface, but Marcus felt the shift like a cold draft under the door. Neighbors who'd previously waved now pretended not to see him. One afternoon he caught a man across the street taking photos of the side yard, then vanishing when Marcus stepped outside. Garbage cans were knocked over, though never anyone else's. On 3 separate occasions he found anonymous notes folded and stuck between his fence slats, each bearing a variation of the same sentence. "This isn't the kind of place for pools like that." Marcus didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, he documented everything. He started logging incidents, noting times and dates, saving envelopes and letters. He wasn't about to spiral into paranoia, but he'd been around long enough to know that fights aren't won by yelling louder. They're won by keeping receipts. And still, through all of it, he kept the pool running. He checked the chlorine levels twice a week, skimmed leaves off the surface every morning, and made sure the pump operated within noise regulations. On Sundays, he and Noah played a quiet game of water tag. On Wednesdays, they floated silently, the boy tucked into his father's side, staring at the sky. But Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before concerns turned into complaints. And complaints, in places like this, had a way of becoming weapons. He wasn't afraid exactly, but he'd seen enough to know that the most dangerous things in a neighborhood weren't dogs off leash or fences an inch too high. It was people like Karen, armed not with facts or authority, but with assumptions, and a burning need to enforce a version of normal that left no room for someone like him. It didn't take long. 3 days after Karen's doorstep debut, a formal-looking envelope appeared in Marcus's mailbox. No stamp, no postmark, just "Private Notice" typed in all caps on the front and slid between junk mail like a knife slipped under skin. Marcus opened it in his kitchen, half expecting a passive-aggressive flyer about lawn maintenance or a neighborhood bake sale. Instead, he found a printed letter on thick cream paper with a header reading, "Community Oversight Group, Resident Notification," and beneath that a dated memorandum accusing him of unauthorized modification of residential landscape, citing code, sections he had never seen before, alleging that the pool installation, though technically approved by the city, violated community harmony standards as outlined in recently adopted neighborhood provisions. There were no signatures, just a return address, the same cul-de-sac where Karen's house stood. He stood in the kitchen for several minutes just staring at the language, feeling something rise in his throat that was not fear and not exactly anger, but a low, smoldering defiance. The words were so careful, so polished, so non-confrontational, and yet so unmistakably personal. It was a trap of decorum, paper-thin civility wrapped around a dagger, and Marcus had seen enough bureaucracy in his life to recognize the maneuver. They weren't trying to solve a problem. They were building a paper wall around him, waiting for him to blink. He didn't blink. Instead, Marcus drafted a reply that night, using plain language but firm tone. He asked for clarification. Which provision, adopted by whom, and when? He requested a meeting with the so-called oversight group, noting that he had received no advance notice about any community revisions. He made copies of everything and dropped the envelope at the same return address, Karen Street, just after sunrise the next day. He didn't bother ringing the bell. There was no point. The next escalation came not in the form of a letter, but through his son. It was the following Monday when Marcus noticed that Noah had become unusually quiet after school. The boy had a habit of narrating his day, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in rambling excitement. But that afternoon, he said almost nothing. He ate slowly, barely touched his juice, and when Marcus asked how recess went, Noah shrugged and muttered something about sitting by the fence. Marcus didn't push at first. He knew better than to pry while the wound was still raw, but later that evening, while folding laundry, he found a crumpled drawing in Noah's backpack, a pencil sketch of the school playground with his son drawn small and off to one side. The other children were clustered far away, speech bubbles floating over their heads. One read, "That's the pool kid." Another, "My mom said he's not safe." Marcus stood there, the shirt still half folded in his hands, staring at the paper until his vision blurred. The fight, until now, had been theoretical. Local politics, petty complaints, neighborhood power trips. But now it had reached Noah's world, seeping through walls Marcus had worked so hard to fortify, contaminating a space where his son should have been untouched. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't march down the street or start knocking on doors. What he did was simpler and sharper. He made an appointment with an attorney. The firm wasn't flashy. No marble floors, no leather chairs, just a tidy two-room office downtown run by a woman named Caroline Baird, who had worked for the city years ago before setting up her own practice in civil disputes and residential zoning issues. She listened without interrupting as Marcus laid everything out, every letter, every interaction, every carefully worded note, and when he was finished, she asked one question. "Have they taken formal action?" "Not yet," Marcus said, "but I can feel it coming." She nodded. "Let's get ahead of it." Caroline helped Marcus file a formal inquiry with the city's planning department, requesting confirmation that the pool installation met all municipal requirements. She also prepared a cease and desist template in the event further unsolicited letters appeared and reviewed the so-called provisions cited in the anonymous notice. As she suspected, they were nothing more than recommendations from an informal neighborhood assembly, with no legal authority or binding clauses. What struck her most, however, was the subtext. "They're not after your pool," she said. "They're after you. The pool is just the excuse." Meanwhile, the neighborhood atmosphere thickened. Some parents began quietly avoiding Marcus at school pickups. One woman he barely knew cornered him at the mailbox and asked, sotto voce, whether the rumors were true. "You know, about surveillance?" When Marcus asked what she meant, she just mumbled something about neighborhood safety and walked away. Even deliveries changed. Packages were no longer left at his front door, but dumped unceremoniously at the base of his mailbox. A contractor he'd scheduled to quote a small deck repair canceled last minute, citing client concerns. When Marcus pressed, the man admitted, uncomfortably, that he'd heard from someone on the block that the house was under review. It wasn't just social pressure. It was economic, logistical. An effort to box him in, to starve out his sense of normalcy. But Marcus didn't give in. He doubled down on maintenance, kept the pool crystal clear, swept the sidewalk daily, and began greeting every passerby with the same quiet courtesy he always had. He was a wall, unmoving, unfazed, and absolutely deliberate. But when the second letter came, Marcus knew the gloves were coming off. This one was less vague. It came certified, delivered by a courier with an electronic tablet for signature. The sender was now formalized. South Hill Neighborhood Committee, a name Marcus had never heard before but which now claimed authority to review community-enhancing modifications. The letter cited not just his pool, but the hours of use, noise, levels, and unmonitored child interactions. It alleged that multiple neighbors had expressed concern over the lack of familial supervision, and potential emotional distress to children witnessing isolated male-led recreation activities. Marcus reread that line 3 times before he folded the letter and placed it into the folder Caroline had labeled Targeted Communications. He didn't shout. He didn't break. But that night, as Noah slept, Marcus sat in the backyard beside the pool, staring into the water's reflection, and understood something that made his stomach tighten. This wasn't going to go away. It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a cultural clash. It was a full-on campaign, rooted not in regulation but in perception, in the idea that a man alone must be watched, contained, silenced. And yet, despite everything, Marcus found himself calm, not numb, not detached, but clear. The fight ahead wouldn't be fought with fists or fury. It would be fought with precision, with patience, with records and rules and an iron will that no whisper campaign could erode. They wanted him to make a mistake, to lash out, to lose composure, to give them the weapon they needed. He wouldn't give it to them. Instead, he would hold the line. And if they pushed harder, he would push back not with noise, but with something far more dangerous. Quiet, undeniable legitimacy. The truth, backed by documents and dates and stone-cold facts. The kind of truth that doesn't shout but waits in silence until the lies run out of air. By the end of the following week, the tone of the neighborhood had shifted so subtly it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention. But Marcus noticed everything. The way people paused just slightly when walking past his house. The way conversations across the street quieted when he opened his front door. The sudden scarcity of eye contact from neighbors who just a month ago had smiled at him in the grocery store. It wasn't hostility, not overtly. It was something colder, more practiced. A silent campaign of exclusion. But silence wasn't their only weapon. Early Thursday morning, while preparing to take Noah to a scheduled therapy session downtown, Marcus noticed a wooden stake had been hammered into the ground just outside his side fence. It held a laminated notice, printed and formatted to look official, stating that the Community Review Board was conducting a passive inspection of properties under assessment for environmental compliance. Marcus stared at it, expressionless, then calmly removed the sign and set it aside. He photographed it from every angle, printed the photos at a nearby office store, and added them to his growing file, now organized into color-coded tabs at the bottom of a locked cabinet in his dining room. That same day, Marcus received a message from a fellow parent, Brandon Ellis, whose daughter Emma was in Noah's 3rd grade class. The text was short. "You got a minute to talk? Something weird came up at school." When they met later that afternoon in a coffee shop 2 towns over, Brandon looked uncomfortable, like a man caught in a position he hadn't asked for. He explained that earlier in the week, several parents had received an anonymous group email implying there had been concerning activity at Marcus's home involving unattended minors and water-based recreation. The message didn't make any direct accusations, but the language was vague and suggestive, designed to stir discomfort without saying anything actionable. Brandon, skeptical by nature, had traced the email headers and found the message originated from a temporary account connected to a proxy service in Nevada, clearly meant to mask the sender's identity. "I'm not buying any of it," he told Marcus, "but not everyone's going to take the time to check. These people want your name to become a question mark. Not guilty, just uncertain." Marcus thanked him, added the printed email chain to his folder, and later that evening filed a report with the local police. Not to accuse anyone, but to create an official record. The officer on duty seemed unsure what to make of it, but Marcus was calm and deliberate. "This isn't about an incident," he explained. "It's about a pattern. I need the paper trail." Over the next week, the interference escalated. The city sanitation truck missed his pickup twice in a row. His landscaping service, previously dependable, suddenly couldn't get clearance to enter the block, claiming someone had told them the area was under construction. Marcus drove to the company's office and met with the manager in person. who confirmed the information came from a caller claiming to be a city representative. No record of such a call existed in the municipal records. It was subtle, it was smart, and it was unmistakably deliberate. Still, Marcus held firm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't post online. He made calls, documented everything, and kept his posture steady, his voice level. Every evening he walked the perimeter of his property, checked the gate locks, tested the pool's chemical balance, and kept Noah on his usual routine. If the goal was to make him crack, they were going to have to try harder. But then came the inspection. It happened on a Wednesday morning, unannounced. Marcus had just returned from the grocery store when a white SUV pulled into his driveway. Two individuals stepped out, one in business casual, the other in a generic municipal vest. They introduced themselves as community infrastructure evaluators and stated they were conducting random assessments of water management systems in residential areas adjacent to shared green zones. Marcus knew immediately it was bogus. There was no shared green zone within 5 blocks. He asked to see credentials. The one in the vest hesitated, then handed over a laminated badge with a name and a barcode, but no agency seal. Marcus stepped back and said simply, "This isn't valid. You need to leave." The man's demeanor shifted. His politeness flickered and he dropped his voice. "You can make this easier on yourself." Marcus didn't flinch. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The woman stepped forward, tried a different tactic. "You're drawing a lot of attention to yourself. That's not good. Why not just make this easier for everyone?" Marcus responded by opening his phone, activating the camera, and asking again for their credentials. They left. Within hours, another certified letter arrived, this time citing non-cooperation with community representatives. It warned of potential consequences for obstruction of inspection protocols. Marcus drove directly to the city's building department and presented the letter. The clerk confirmed no inspections had been scheduled, no notices issued, and no departments authorized random evaluations without formal paperwork. Caroline, his attorney, followed up by sending a cease and desist letter to the South Hill Committee, demanding immediate cessation of all unauthorized contact, notices, and property interactions. They received no response. The next tactic was personal. One evening, after putting Noah to bed, Marcus stepped outside to close the garden shed and noticed a small pile of broken glass near the edge of his back gate. Someone had thrown a bottle over the fence. No note, no sign, just a shattered mess and a quiet message. Marcus didn't call the police that night. Instead, he collected the glass, sealed it in a bag, labeled it with the date, and placed it into his cabinet. The next morning, he bought 2 new cameras, motion-triggered, night vision enabled, and installed them discreetly around the perimeter. When Caroline called to check in, he updated her without emotion. "They're not backing off. They're shifting gears." She asked if he was okay. He said yes. He was lying. He wasn't okay. Not because he was scared, he'd stopped fearing them a while ago, but because he was starting to understand that this wasn't going to end cleanly. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a conflict that could be mediated. It was war by attrition, a campaign to grind him down, one inconvenience, one innuendo at a time. And the worst part wasn't what they were doing to him. It was what they were doing to Noah. The boy had stopped inviting friends over. He asked if they could skip the pool sometimes, even on hot days. "People look at us weird," he said once, almost apologetically. Marcus never pressed, never demanded more. But inside, something hardened. He knew the line had been crossed, not in a letter, not in a sign, but in his son's voice. And that changed everything. Marcus began planning. Not retaliation, not revenge, but something more effective. He contacted a former contractor friend who now worked with recreational planning and began asking questions about private event licensing, short-term property use, and family-based recreational zoning. If they wanted to turn his private life into a public spectacle, he'd meet them on that battlefield, on paper, with forms and clauses and line items they couldn't manipulate with gossip and smirks. They wanted him out. Fine. But he wasn't going anywhere. And if they pushed harder, they'd soon find out just how much noise a quiet man can make when he's done being polite. It was the first Saturday of June when Marcus unveiled what he had quietly spent weeks preparing, not with a banner or a loudspeaker, but with a table and a clipboard. By 8 a.m., while the neighborhood was still wrapped in the haze of early morning coffee and watered lawns, Marcus set out a sign in front of his yard that read simply, "Open Family Swim and Parent Rest Zone, Private Access Only," beneath which hung a laminated notice with 3 phrases printed in bold: "Waivers required, children must be accompanied, and licensed for temporary use." It was not a protest. It was not a provocation. It was, as far as Marcus was concerned, an act of survival through precision. Every word on that sign had been vetted by his attorney. Every document laminated and signed was on file. The licensing had been obtained through a short-term private use permit under the city's Recreational Development Clause, often used for temporary art installations and community garden pop-ups. Marcus had simply reinterpreted the language to describe his pool as a family enrichment zone, a place for supervised recreation, rest, and water-based therapy. He hadn't sent out invitations. He hadn't posted flyers. But word had traveled on its own. By mid-morning, 2 children from the opposite end of the block arrived with their mother, a woman Marcus had seen but never spoken to. She handed him the signed waiver and stood silently as the kids dipped their feet into the water and laughed. She never asked what this was all about. She didn't need to. By noon, 3 more families had shown up, all unannounced, all with documents in hand. They spoke in soft tones, polite and reserved, as if unsure how much to enjoy themselves without drawing scrutiny. One father, a mail carrier named Jeff, offered Marcus a nod and muttered, "Don't let them scare you off." It wasn't support, exactly. It was solidarity, the quiet kind that men of a certain age recognize not in words, but in presence. The most ironic moment came later that afternoon when a woman in oversized sunglasses and a large sun hat arrived with 2 children in tow, flanked by a young woman carrying a beach tote and looking unsure. Marcus didn't recognize them at first, but when the woman lifted her sunglasses to sign the waiver, the expression on her face stopped him cold. It was Karen Whitlock. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't smile. She handed over the paperwork, nodded to the woman behind her, clearly the nanny, and took a seat at the far end of the yard, as if daring him to say something. Marcus didn't. He accepted the form, added it to his folder, and offered the same words he'd said to every other visitor. "Please, keep an eye on your kids, and let me know if you need sunscreen or water." For the next 2 hours, Karen's grandkids played in the pool. Like everyone else, splashing and shouting and enjoying what had been so aggressively denied to Marcus just weeks before. When they left, she didn't speak. She just gathered her things, nodded curtly, and disappeared down the sidewalk. It was not an apology. It was not even an acknowledgement. It was a retreat disguised as participation, a face-saving maneuver. And Marcus understood it for what it was, the first crack in their armor. But cracks have a way of spreading. By Monday morning, the inbox of the city's residential affairs office was flooded with complaints, some vague, others hostile, about Marcus's recreational operation. The word business appeared multiple times. Someone had described it as a for-profit splash zone. Another claimed there were unmonitored strangers entering the block. The language had changed. No longer subtle or coded, it was now openly alarmist. Marcus was prepared. He submitted his permit documentation, showed photographs of the signed waivers, and provided a visitor log. His permit covered temporary recreational use, with a strict attendance cap, no fees, and mandatory parental presence. The city's initial response was simple: no violations identified. The formal clarity only seemed to provoke his detractors further. That same evening, Marcus returned home to find a printed flyer taped to his front gate. It read, "Do you know who your neighbors really are?" Below the headline was a generic image of children playing in a pool, overlaid with phrases like "no background checks," "no certified supervision," and "unlicensed operation." It was unsigned. Marcus removed it calmly, placed it with the others in his folder, and called Caroline. She wasn't surprised. "They're losing traction," she said. "When fear doesn't work, they escalate." Noah, who had grown quieter with each passing week, finally spoke up that night as they ate dinner. He asked, "Why do they hate our house?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, really looked, and then leaned forward and said, "They don't hate our house. They're just afraid of what they don't control." Noah chewed in silence for a moment, then asked, "Will they make us leave?" Marcus shook his head. Not a chance. What happened next was not a battle, but an adjustment of tone. The following weekend, several new faces appeared at the pool, families Marcus had never seen before. One father explained they were from 3 blocks away, that they'd heard about the setup from a coworker. He brought his own folding chairs and asked if there were posted hours. Another mother offered to bring snacks next time. Marcus, always the logistician, quietly revised his sign to include a suggested quiet period and printed a flyer listing simple rules. It wasn't formal, it wasn't permanent, but it was working, which meant it was also drawing fresh fire. Karen hadn't spoken since her unannounced visit, but Marcus noticed her car idling on the corner twice that week. Other neighbors, previously indifferent, now avoided even the pretense of friendliness. One woman began hosing down her driveway whenever Marcus passed, regardless of weather or time of day. Petty signals. But the most telling development came not from hostility, but from exposure. A neighbor Marcus barely knew, an older man named Glenn, stopped him by the mailbox and handed him a folded paper. It was a printed screenshot of a private group chat titled South Hill Community Watch. Glenn didn't say where he got it. He just muttered, "Thought you ought to see this," and walked away. The chat transcript was illuminating. Karen was one of the moderators. The posts included suggestions about calling code enforcement, contacting child services, and submitting anonymous tips. One message read, "We can't let this become the new normal. If he wins, others will follow." Marcus read it twice, then placed the printout into his folder. No anger, no shock, just confirmation. They weren't trying to protect children. They weren't trying to safeguard property values. They were trying to erase anything that challenged their grip on the narrative of the neighborhood. But narratives, Marcus knew, are fragile things. They depend on control, on silence, on fear, and he wasn't afraid anymore. The pool was more than water. It was defiance. It was stability. It was a safe space carved from spite and reclaimed with resolve. And now it was a community. Even if it was small, even if it was fragile, it was his, and he would protect it. Not with fences, not with rage, but with the one thing his enemies lacked: legitimacy, documented and undeniable, and a will that didn't need permission to stand its ground. The second escalation didn't arrive with a bang. It seeped in, quietly and thoroughly, like smoke through a cracked window, unseen until it was thick enough to choke. Marcus first noticed it when one of the families who'd been regular visitors to the pool stopped showing up. No message, no call, just absence. Then another, and another. By the end of the week, the once vibrant weekend gatherings had dwindled to a cautious trickle. One father with his toddler in the early morning, another family who left before noon, avoiding eye contact. At first, Marcus assumed it was fatigue or the shifting tides of summer plans, But then Jeff, the mail carrier and one of the first to support the pool effort, approached him during a delivery, looking uneasy. "You got mentioned in a letter," Jeff said under his breath. "Circulated through the parent-teacher email tree. It didn't come from the school, but it's got their logo at the top. Someone's trying to make it look official." The letter, which Jeff discreetly printed and handed to Marcus, was written in bureaucratic language, full of concern about unsanctioned, gathering spots, and unverified adult supervision. It didn't name Marcus directly, but the descriptions, residential water installation, lack of educational affiliation, non-certified gatherings, left no doubt about the intended target. Worse still, it implied that children who participated might be inadvertently placed at risk, urging parents to make thoughtful decisions about extracurricular environments. It wasn't defamation. It wasn't actionable. But it was poison, a crafted memo designed to infect trust and spread doubt. Marcus didn't flinch. He took the letter home, scanned it into his records, and sent a copy to Caroline. She replied in under an hour. "We've got a pattern now. This isn't about aesthetics or zoning. This is character assassination." The same day, Marcus received notice from the city sanitation department. His property had been flagged for an environmental reevaluation due to non-standard runoff concerns. The implication was that his pool's water system might be affecting the surrounding soil. It was absurd. He'd installed an advanced filtration system with overflow control, had followed every city recommendation. Still, he welcomed the inspection. When the technician arrived, a wiry man in a brown jumpsuit who looked more like a mechanic than an environmental scientist, Marcus greeted him with documents already laid out on a patio table. Installation certifications, maintenance logs, photographs, a schematic from the contractor. The man blinked, adjusted his clipboard, and, without speaking, began his review. He spent exactly 13 minutes on site, then left without comment. 2 days later, Marcus received a clean bill of environmental health in the mail. But the message had been sent. They weren't looking for violations. They were trying to flood him with friction. That same week, Marcus received 3 anonymous packages. The first was filled with torn swimsuit catalogs, sliced into strips and stuffed into a box labeled Private. The second contained a single flip-flop, size child's 4, burned along the sole. The third was a sealed envelope with nothing inside, just a blank piece of paper, pristine and untouched. Marcus didn't react outwardly. He wore gloves, bagged each item, labeled them with dates and delivery photos, and filed a report with local police. The officer, same one as before, seemed more attentive this time. "You think it's local?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "I think it's coordinated." "You want to press for a harassment case?" "Not yet," he said, "but I want this documented, every inch of it." The officer agreed and added a new incident number to his growing file. Marcus left the station and went directly to the local postmaster, requesting the names of delivery drivers for his route over the past month. It wasn't an accusation. It was process. The postmaster agreed to flag his address for irregular deliveries. They wouldn't stop what was happening, but they would start watching. And now, so would others. That weekend, while taking out the trash, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement from the property line. Something small and quick. He didn't chase. He didn't shout. Instead, he reviewed the footage from his cameras the next morning and found a grainy shot of a teenager tossing what looked like a dead squirrel toward his back fence. It bounced off the gate and landed in the grass. Marcus forwarded the footage to Caroline, who immediately advised contacting animal control, not just to remove the animal, but to file a formal cruelty report. "If someone's using dead animals as warnings," she said, "that's no longer mischief. That's targeted intimidation." When the officer arrived to take the report, she was quiet for a long time as she looked around the property. Finally, she said, "You're handling this better than most would. But be careful. People who escalate like this, They're testing how far they can go. Marcus nodded. He already knew. The next escalation came in the form of silence, strategic and deafening. His internet slowed to a crawl. Phone service flickered. He thought it was just bad reception until he realized it only happened during certain hours, and only when he was home. It was Jeff again who tipped him off. You might want to check your utility connections. Word is, someone's been making calls pretending to be the homeowner, trying to update service plans. Marcus called his providers and flagged his accounts. He changed passwords, locked his records, added verbal pins to every service. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic. It was tedious, exhausting defense work. But it was necessary. And it worked. The attempts stopped, temporarily. Then, one evening, as Noah sat watching a documentary about sea creatures, Marcus stepped outside to find his shed door open. He hadn't used it in 2 days. Inside, several tools had been rearranged. Nothing missing, but everything touched. He checked the lock. It hadn't been broken. It had been picked. He called Caroline again. She didn't hesitate. You need a motion alarm. You need insurance documentation. And if there's another breach, we go to civil court with a restraining petition. Not just for harassment, but for criminal interference. Marcus followed her advice. Within 48 hours, he had new locks, new lighting, and a private insurer documenting his inventory. If they wanted to erode his safety, they'd have to get through layers now, not just walls. But perhaps the cruelest turn came from the school. Noah came home with a note requesting a parent-teacher behavior conference. No warning, no context, just a polite summons. When Marcus arrived, the teacher, clearly uncomfortable, explained that other parents had expressed concern about Noah's emotional environment at home. The language was vague, the allegations even more so. There were no incidents, no academic issues, just concerns. Marcus asked if any of those parents had met him. The teacher admitted they hadn't. Then what exactly are they concerned about? He asked. That I swim with my son. She had no answer. He walked out, not angrily, but quietly, and took Noah to the library afterward. They checked out 3 books and went for milkshakes. That night, Marcus stared at his calendar and circled a date in July. That would be the launch of Phase 2. If they wanted war, he'd give them water. Organized, licensed, permitted water. Because this wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about showing them what happens when quiet men are pushed too far, and choose to stand, not shout. The morning of the event came without ceremony. No fireworks, no celebratory banner. Just the steady sound of pool water cycling through the filter and the low hum of a rented generator tucked behind the shed. Marcus had spent weeks preparing, not with lawyers or journalists or online outrage, but with permits, city approvals, liability waivers, and a stack of insurance forms that now weighed more than his son's school backpack. He hadn't called it a protest. He hadn't even advertised it. But word had traveled, not through confrontation but through invitation. A quiet network of parents, local workers, even a few city employees who understood exactly what was at stake. Oku, he called it Family Float Day. A private, one-day recreational gathering for licensed guardians and their children, registered through a neighborhood recreational activity form, same as any picnic or home workshop open to the public by RSVP. Everything had been filed correctly, notarized, cleared. It was unimpeachable. And yet Marcus knew they would come. They always came when they thought the rules no longer applied. Around 10:40 a.m., just as the first group of families was settling in with folding chairs and fruit boxes, a silver sedan pulled up across the street and idled. The driver didn't exit, but Marcus didn't need a better look. He recognized the square-shouldered silhouette and stiff posture immediately. Karen Whitlock. She remained inside, hidden behind tinted windows, her presence a statement of disapproval rendered in steel and glass. Marcus didn't look her way again. At noon, the gate creaked open again, and a man stepped inside. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, clipboard in hand, wearing khakis and a navy polo with a stitched badge over the chest that read, Code Compliance Officer. He introduced himself as Brian. Halstead, speaking with the calm of someone who knew exactly what kind of power his title implied. "We received a community complaint," he said. "Unlicensed public gathering, potential health code violations. I need to inspect the premises." Marcus met him halfway. "This isn't a public event. It's a private, permitted recreational function under Municipal Code 118.7. Documents are in the binder here." He handed Halstead the binder, 3 inches thick, organized by date and category, with colored flags and duplicates of every form. Halstead blinked, taken off guard. He flipped through the first few pages, then checked a number against a notepad in his pocket. "Did the city issue a secondary noise permit?" he asked. "Not required for gatherings under 30 persons without amplified sound," Marcus replied. Section 2-12.1. Noise is monitored. Here's the decibel tracker app linked to the file. He tapped the phone clipped to his belt and showed the live reading, well below ordinance limits. Halstead studied him for a long moment, then looked out at the children in the pool, parents standing nearby, talking quietly. There was no music, no shouting, just a summer scene, controlled and deliberate. "Do you mind if I walk the perimeter?" "As long as you don't photograph anyone's children or disrupt supervision." Halstead nodded and did his round. 10 minutes later he returned and closed the binder. "Everything looks in order. You'll get an email confirmation this week." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't thank him. He simply said, "Have a safe afternoon," and turned back to the guests. Halstead left. But Karen didn't. Her car remained until nearly 2 p.m., and only after most of the visitors had gone did she finally step out. She wore dark glasses, a pressed linen suit, and an expression like granite. She approached the gate but did not enter. "You really think this is over?" she asked, voice low and sharp. Marcus didn't approach her. He remained where he was, hands loose at his sides. "It's not over," he said. "It's just no longer yours to control." Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a sneer. "You brought strangers into our neighborhood. You put our kids in danger." "Your grandkids were here," Marcus said calmly. "Twice. You signed the waivers yourself." Karen's jaw clenched, her silence stiffer than any accusation. "I know what you're trying to do," she said finally. "You think you can force us to accept this, but we're not going to normalize men like you making decisions for our community." Marcus took a step forward, not aggressive, but anchored. "Men like me? You mean fathers? Working people? Homeowners who don't ask for permission to exist?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to leave, but not before she spoke one more sentence, loud enough for the empty street to hear. "I promise you, people will remember what you are." Marcus stood in place as her words settled like dust on concrete. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Because as she walked away, one of the other parents, Jeff, stepped forward. He'd been near the porch, overhearing every word. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "We already remember what he is. That's why we came." Karen paused, turned slightly, and for the first time in weeks she looked uncertain. Not afraid, not defeated, but unsure of her control, of her reach, of how easily her narrative was unraveling. She walked away. That night, Marcus sat beside the pool after Noah had gone to bed. The water shimmered under the motion lights, still and silent. The day had been calm, even beautiful, but the undercurrent was clear. This was a war of attrition and she wasn't finished. But neither was he. Because today, for the first time, the neighborhood had chosen not silence or distance, but presence. They had come not to challenge, but but to stand beside. That mattered. That meant something. And Marcus understood the truth that had quietly crystallized over months of pressure, exclusion, and suspicion. The battle wasn't over a pool. It never was. It was about who gets to define safety, who controls belonging, and how far someone will go to keep others small. But Marcus had built something bigger than a backyard oasis. He had built a shield, quiet, structured, inviolable. A place where assumptions collapsed under the weight of facts. And, for the first time, he knew that shield could hold. The end didn't come with a final confrontation. No arrests, no media swarms. No one knocked on Marcus's door with apologies or dramatic admissions of guilt. Instead, it ended the way most battles do when fought in the realm of silence, paper, and quiet resolve, through exhaustion, attrition, and quiet rebalancing. A week after the family float day, Marcus received a formal letter from the city council stating that all inquiries into his property and recreational setup were considered closed with no action required. It included a line that felt colder than any threat. No further intervention is deemed necessary at this time. It wasn't a declaration of support. It was bureaucracy's way of retreating, quietly stepping away from the noise, unwilling to acknowledge the forces that had pushed them to act in the first place. Still, Marcus accepted it. He logged the letter, filed it, and returned to his routines. He kept the pool running, though he limited guest visits. Not out of fear, but out of fatigue. The war had taken something out of him that no permit or policy could restore. He cleaned more than he used to, kept the lights on longer at night, triple-checked locks, and started teaching Noah subtle safety habits without making them seem like warnings. He didn't want his son to inherit paranoia, but he also wouldn't raise him unarmed in a world where perception could be weaponized. The neighbors didn't change overnight. Some still avoided eye contact. Others remained silent. But the worst of it, the letters, the slander, the anonymous sabotage, stopped. Or rather, they fizzled out. The machinery had lost momentum. The meetings, the whisper campaigns, the petty gestures of social punishment no longer had the force they once carried. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was exposure. Perhaps they simply realized that Marcus wasn't going to move, bend, or break. Whatever the reason, the pressure led up, and with it came space to breathe. And in that space, something unexpected emerged. Acknowledgement. Not from Karen. She remained a ghost, visible but inert, stripped of the righteous energy that had once made her so dangerous. She kept her distance, offered no gestures of reconciliation, but also stopped watching. She became what she should have always been, just another neighbor. The acknowledgement came from elsewhere. One evening, as Marcus was sweeping the patio, a man from 3 houses down, retired, quiet, had never spoken a word to him before, walked over and said simply, "I was wrong." Marcus paused, unsure how to respond. The man clarified. "Not about the pool, about you. I should have said something earlier." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He just handed Marcus a folded envelope with 4 guest passes for the local Waterpark and walked away. A day later, someone dropped off a potted plant with no note. The following week, a pair of teenagers knocked on the door and asked if they could do odd jobs to earn money for college prep. Slowly, subtly, the community reshaped around him, not with celebration or declarations, but through restored normalcy. The absence of hostility, in this case, was the greatest victory. For Noah, the change was more visible. He began inviting friends over again. He started sleeping through the night. He asked Marcus to teach him how to maintain the pool filter, how to test chemical levels, how to balance pH. It wasn't about water. It was about reclaiming peace, one step at a time. Marcus never spoke publicly about what happened. He never gave interviews or posted rants online. He didn't write op-eds or record TikToks or draft open letters. He kept everything in a folder, neatly organized, stored in a fireproof safe. It was for him, and maybe for Noah one day, a record not of a fight, but of a refusal to surrender. The real closure came not through the system, but through repetition. Each time Marcus dipped his hand into the pool and felt the cool water, each time he refilled the chlorine dispenser or replaced a tile or skimmed the surface for leaves, he did so with the knowledge that the pool remained. Not because he won a war, but because he stayed. And in a world so eager to exile anyone who doesn't conform to its quiet fears, sometimes staying, simply staying, is the most defiant act of all.